Welcome everyone to another video. Today we are doing something we like to call OG versus reboot. The concept for this is we watch the original version of a movie and the reboot or remake, and then we review them both. Today we are reviewing Carrie, and so we went back and watched the old version and the newer version featuring, I think, Chloe Grace Moretz, and we also are mixing it up even more in that we are doing a collab. We are continuing our collabs but doing a different type of video.
So today we are doing this video with Casey. We will link her channel up in the corner. She's an Australian. She's fantastic. You should go subscribe to her, especially if you like how our channel is not just movie related and we have other things. Her channel is very similar to that, but with different topics.
So to kick things off, we are going to give you guys a review of the original Carrie before throwing things over to Casey. Now, if you have never heard of this movie, it's based on a Stephen King novel, and it follows a young girl who realizes she has telekinetic powers, and things go crazy from there.
So with this review, we're going to start by talking about Carrie. So the original Carrie is played by Sissy Spacek. How do you say
Spacek?
it?
Something like that.
I think she was fantastic in the role. She played the demure but becomes badass quite well. And she looks so much like a combo of Lindsay Lohan and who else did I say? Elizabeth Olsen. Uncanny. But she did great. I think she did the performance really well. I think Carrie is a really interesting character, and the original, she's very nuanced and subtle in the way she changes, but it ends up having a very big impact on the story.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how she's a reserved yet very emotional character, and she does a great job with it. And we also have the other main character is her mother, and she plays a huge role in Carrie's development and the development of the story. She is very religious, and how she interacts with Carrie and treats Carrie is kind of the focus of this story, and how her powers affect that relationship and how that relationship affects Carrie and her powers.
We also have a slew of side characters. Carrie is in high school. There's a lot of bullies involved, a few potential allies. There's a lot going on, and I think all the side characters in this original one were very, they weren't really fleshed out, but I also don't think they needed to be for the storyline being so focused on Carrie and her mom. I think that the side characters played in where they needed to, but they just weren't big pieces in terms of character traits or development.
Yeah, there's some time spent on them. I was continually surprised at how sociopathic some of these kids are in high school, as classic horror goes. Some of these kids are terrible, terrible people. And shout out to a surprise show of John Travolta, because we did not expect him, and this was actually one of his earliest movies.
I think it was his...
Was it his first?
I think so.
But
which we'll talk about that theme in a minute.
Yeah, he's such a youngin', but it very much surprised us. He just popped up. We're like, oh.
So with this being a classic horror film, it was a very interesting tone throughout the movie. This movie came out in 1976, I believe, and it has a very classic horror feel to it, but it also has this weird undertone of it being horrific, but not quite comical, but it's a weird, not straight horror, but it leans I don't know, overdone in some ways, but in a on purpose way. I don't know quite how to explain it, but I was reading some trivia after we watched this movie, and it turns out that a lot of the actors and actresses in this movie didn't quite understand what the tone or genre of this film was. They didn't think it was a straight-up horror film. They thought it was more of a dark black comedy. And so their performances make a lot more sense knowing that to me, and it makes for a very interesting dynamic throughout the whole film.
Yeah, because it's a classic horror movie, I feel like there's a certain level of camp involved there, and it doesn't take itself, for a very serious movie, it almost doesn't always feel super serious.
But it's also not humorous. There's no tone of humor in it. It's odd, but good.
And I think that something that really affects the tone and keeps it in the horror setting, though, is the cinematography. Something that we noticed is this film, all the shots feel very calculated, and even if the subject matter wasn't the most interesting, every shot seemed very precise in how they wanted to show things, and it felt like they presented a lot of subtext and things just based on how they put the camera. And it's always interesting to me when people use cinematography to try and evoke emotions, and some of the ways the camera creeps in here builds tension in scenes that really have no tension. And I think that goes with old horror movies as well. There's lots of scenes in this that are not scary at all. There's no horror element involved, but because of the music and the way the camera creeps or does things, you get like a weird feeling while you're watching.
It draws you into the film in a way where you feel like a spectator, like in the room, and it also gives it kind of claustrophobic feel, at least it did for me, which just like made you feel all the things, which I think any good horror movie does that. It makes you feel part of the story. Overall, my thoughts on this movie is this is actually probably one of my new favorite horror movies. I had never seen this before. I haven't read the book, although I plan to because I love Stephen King. But it was really fascinating, and I wasn't completely sold on it for the first like half. But the second half, or like last third of the film, really sold it for me. The climax, I think, was just excellently done for such a classic horror film, and I think that it holds up to today, at least in my personal opinion and personal taste. I think it was just excellently done.
Yeah, I feel like it was definitely a surprise with how enjoyable it was for such a dated movie. And we really liked the original, and to give you Casey's view on the original and the reboot, we're going to throw that over to her now.
Hi, my name's Casey Causley, and like Britt and Steven, I also make videos about movies, TV shows, books, etc. sometimes in my life. I'm super excited to be making a collab because I know, Britt, that we've been talking about this for ages and trying to come up with something, and we just haven't had a chance to do it yet, and that's probably mostly my fault because I do too many things, but I'm so glad to be here and talking about the Carrie movies. So to get on to talking about the Carrie movies, the first thing I have to tell you is I'm actually not a huge fan of either of them, to be quite honest. One of the projects that I do on my channel is to do the 1001 movies to watch before you die list. So I actually watched the 1976 version a couple of years ago, and I wasn't impressed by it. The film is probably half an hour too long, and considering it's only about a 98-minute movie in the first place, that is saying something. Honestly, I just think not a lot happens. It basically goes from a bad thing happens to Carrie, she's sad about it, her mum goes crazy, people try to help her, another bad thing happens, and she goes full crazy, and that's pretty much all it is. I feel like that could have been covered in maybe half an hour or an hour. So while I think the message is particularly good, the message being don't be mean to people or you will regret it later, and I think there are quite a few efficient and really good horror sequences in it, enough to make anyone squeamish, particularly me, I just felt that the film didn't really hold my attention. The remake, however, has both its advantages and its disadvantages. On the one hand, I will never ever say no to an Ansel Elgort performance, but on the other hand, I just felt that Chloe Moretz was maybe not the best choice for this. She's more of a badass character, and in the beginning when Carrie is really vulnerable, I just didn't match those two together in my head. I don't know what it is. There's also the advantage of an improvement in special effects, especially because I did watch the reboot in Blu-ray. However, the fact that the film is still pretty much beat for beat exactly the same as the original kind of makes the reboot appear redundant. There is a slightly different cliffhanger at the end of the reboot, but honestly what that kind of just seemed like was a grab for more additions in this franchise, and that kind of unsettled me a little bit. I was like, maybe try something new, or try a new spin on an old classic. Overall, if you like horror, then the films maybe are one that you really need to see. The backstory between Carrie and her mum adds a really interesting element, which is something that Stephen King often does, but considering this film and other film are an adaptation of a novel that is only 199 pages long, the films are way too long and they contain way too many extraneous build-up scenes which really just don't serve the purpose of what they're trying to do, and that is to make you invested in the characters. I feel bad because I think I told you guys how much I loved these movies, or maybe I told you I was really excited to watch the reboot, and instead of just poured out a rant of how much the reboot reminded me that I hated the original. I'm sorry.
So after hearing Casey's thoughts, it seems pretty apparent that she had some really different feelings from us as to the first one. While she didn't really enjoy it, it's a very big enjoyment for us. However, with the remake, I think a lot of our opinions line up pretty similarly, especially with specific points that Casey made, and so we're going to talk about some of those.
I think my biggest complaint about the reboot is that it is so similar, and it's almost scene for scene, shot for shot, and I know Casey mentioned this, is that yeah, for a reboot, there was even some lines that were like copies of lines and scenes where like it feels like they told Chloe Grace Moretz, do the exact same thing as the character from the first one did in those scenes. And
which is interesting because Chloe Grace Moretz said that she did not watch any previous version of this, because I think there was the main movie and then there was a TV movie later, and she didn't watch either of those because she didn't want to be influenced by previous performances. And also the director said that she didn't set out to make a complete copy or redo of the first one. Instead of being inspired by the first movie, she wanted to be more inspired by the book. But personally, I don't think that came off on film at all. It felt like a blatant copy of the first one with some added elements. But like Steven said, like even some of the camera shots and certain scenes, the way they were like almost storyboarded looked identical. So it's really strange that she said she wasn't making it a plan to do that, and then that's kind of how it turned out.
It's almost hard not to laugh at like hearing that quote because of how similar it is. And like shot for shot, beat for beat, this movie is, and it's like the same, but just not done quite as well.
I think one of the biggest mistakes the remake did was casting Chloe Grace Moretz. I really like Chloe Grace Moretz as an actress. I do think that she doesn't have quite the range as some other actresses. I don't think she can do everything. There's quite a few films that she's fallen flat in. There's quite a few films that she has excelled and shined in. And I just think that she was a poor casting choice for this movie. I feel very similar to Casey on this one, where it's kind of hard to take her seriously in the opening part where she's supposed to be very vulnerable and very shy and just all of these things that Chloe Grace Moretz just does not exude. Like, she exudes confidence and badassery, in my opinion. And so her performance in the first half just felt fake. I would say the second half she was stronger, but I still think that her performance was more obvious than Sissy's was in the first one. Sissy was very understated, very subtle, and Chloe Grace Moretz's performance just took a very different turn.
Yeah, I think the key word there is obvious, because just in general, the style of this film is so obvious. It very much, where the first film leaves things kind of up to the viewer to figure out or to notice, this film is like in your face, and if you didn't notice it, the next scene the characters will say it. Like Chloe Grace Moretz will say to her mother, "This is how I feel about this when you're doing this to me, and I can't believe," like, and it's just so much in your face.
Yeah, the style of this movie is a very early 2000s. Well, mid 2000s, I guess. This came out in 2013. This feels like it came from the same era as like Final Destination and Prom Night and like all of those. Like, honestly, the remake felt like a very similar blend to like Final Destination like 2 or 3 and Prom Night. Like, it felt like they blended those two in style and tone, especially with the climax of the movie, and it just felt like it was a little too modernized in style.
Yeah, something kind of felt off the entire film, because I felt like they lost a lot of the character that the original film had, because the filming was just generic. It felt like a generic teen movie in the way it was filmed, and then the way they chose to go with Carrie's powers activating, it felt just very derivative. It didn't feel like something fresh or something that came into trying to put a nice twist on a classic story or something like that. It just felt like they didn't try very hard with this one.
Something that was also interesting that they changed about the new one is with amping up the violence and the horror aspect of it. Like we said earlier, it's a lot more obvious, a lot less subtle. They almost changed Carrie's purpose at the end of the movie and her motivation. For the first movie, you know, with the climax, it's more of an accidental unleashing of her powers and a buildup of all of this oppression, but it's not done, in my opinion, in like a rage way. At least that's not how Sissy's performance came across. It came across more of a like, I just snapped and I'm not really in control of my actions, and she like very clearly like regrets some of it by the end. But with Chloe Grace Moretz, it's very much a revenge plot in the last third. Like, it's way past the I just had an explosion of power. Like, it goes beyond, and some people might like that, but I personally enjoy the first version better.
I think overall we're in agreement that we definitely enjoyed the first film a lot more than the second one. And I know Casey wasn't a big fan of either. I think she put it very funny in how earlier she said that the second one just reminded me that I didn't like the first one. And I think that's funny because I think the second one just reminded me that I liked the first one a lot better. So it was kind of like, what was the point of watching the second one? So in our opinion, if you want to watch one, you should definitely watch the first one. And if you really like it, you can watch the second one, but you probably don't need to. And we want to give a big shout out to Casey. Like we said, we will link her channel. Go check her out and subscribe. She has bunch of different content and she is fun to watch. Definitely go check her channel out.
And part of the reason I love doing this as a subject, as a series, is because I like seeing different opinions of different YouTubers. So I actually really like that Casey had different opinions to us. It's more refreshing, I think, to have a slew of opinions in one video. So let us know your thoughts down in the comments if you have seen one or either of these movies. What did you think about them? Did you like them? Did you hate them? Who did you agree with more on our review? And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up if you want us to continue this series. And if you have any suggestions for things that have been rebooted or remade, leave them down in the comments and we will add them to our ever-growing list of ideas. And if you like us, please subscribe. We would love to have you join our BS Review family. Like we said earlier, we do a lot of different content on this channel. So if you want to check out any of those videos, you can do so right over there. And we'll see you guys in our next video. Bye!